Well, there we are. Good afternoon, everybody. In case we haven't met yet, my name is Luke Stair. I'm Community Engagement Coordinator here at First Baptist, and I'm filling in for Dr. Wiles today. He is on his way to Rome. If you have been here when I've taught before, good news, it's only infanticide today. So, nothing too challenging, just some babies that get ordered to be murdered. Nice and light. But before we really dive in, I know y'all don't see Tanner too much. He's a gentleman who prayed. He's one of our youth ministers. I want to brag on our youth ministry. They have really worked hard to challenge and support our teenagers to invite their friends to church and invite their friends to explore questions around faith. And in the fall semester, their students invited somewhere between 70 and 80 friends to youth ministry. So, our youth ministry is up to some good work. They're really pushing our students to live evangelistically, to live invitationally, and we're seeing the fruit of that, and it's really encouraging. So Wake Up Weekend this weekend that he talked about is a great opportunity for students to once again invite friends, and for those friends to continue to be exposed to the good news of Jesus. So as we move into this weekend, just remember to pray for our students, to pray for our youth ministry team. They have really worked hard to challenge our teens to live the good news of Jesus out wherever they're going to school, which in this day and age is huge. So, when you see our youth ministry staff, encourage them. They are doing great work. But we are here to talk about Exodus. We're finally in chapter 1, 2 weeks in. We're talking about chapter 1 today. Okay, maybe we'll finish by the new year. So, on a first glance, this is a pretty straightforward chapter. We're in pretty clear narrative. As you see, I've broken the text into 3 chunks. I don't like to give big outlines, and if I were to just give you my notes, there's not a lot there. I'm just working off some bullet points myself. So, but I've broken the text up into a few chunks for you. We have a prologue, and these are the names. That's verses 1 through 7. Verses 8 through 14 are oppression from a nameless king, and Exodus 1, 15 through 22, God delivers through Shiphrah and Puah, and we'll talk about that. So these are the names. That's the first 2 words in the book of Exodus. I know in English that's 4 words. In Hebrew it's 2. It's Ve'ele Shemot. And so the title in Hebrew, as Dr. Wiles has said, is These Are the Names. So this is a story about people with names, which doesn't seem like a groundbreaking concept to us sitting here today reading Exodus, that this is a story about people with names. But in history, when history gets written, who writes the history? Typically the victors, the oppressors. So if Egypt was writing this history, which they didn't, these people wouldn't have names. So the fact that we are reading a book of the Bible about people with names, when in the rest of history they would have been nameless, faceless slaves that history didn't mention, and now we have an entire book of the Bible about them and their exodus out of Egypt. And we get to learn their names, and we get to tell their story. And we need to remember when we read Exodus that this is not just our book. This is the story of the Jewish people. The Exodus is their hallmark event. They symbolically reenact it every year in the festival of Passover. This is, in many ways, their book. There are other groups, Black Christians, for example, lean very heavily into the book of Exodus as well because they see it as part of their story in America as coming out of slavery. So Exodus is also a very significant book in the American Black church. So, there are a lot of people who read Exodus and see their own story in it, specifically, again, Jews and the Black church in America. This story also, we see it typologically play out in the New Testament in the person of Jesus. We'll see some of that today, and we'll point that out. But we can think about events like Herod's slaughter of the innocents, Jesus' own exodus out of Egypt, and Jesus' identity as the Passover lamb. So the New Testament is going to find a lot of significant imagery and fulfillment from the book of Exodus. It's an important book moving forward. So it's a story of the people of God, but it's also the story of this nameless king. And we're going to read about that nameless king today. But isn't that interesting? Again, we have this story about people who entered into slavery not by their own will, people we expect history would have forgotten. And instead, we get their names and their stories, but this king, this Pharaoh of Egypt, we don't get his name. His name is never mentioned in the entire book of Exodus. And there's a lot of debate among scholars over who the Pharaoh during this time would have been. But Moses didn't write it down. He didn't think it was important enough. And isn't that interesting? This is a person Moses personally went toe-to-toe with, and he chooses to never record his name. So the king doesn't get named. Again, these are the names. It's the title of the book. It's 2 words in Hebrew, 4 words in English. And it forms this immediate bridge with what has come before in Genesis. We get the names of Jacob's and his sons' households who are going into Egypt to join Joseph. That's what sets up the story. Joseph is living fat and happy in Egypt. His brothers are living in famine. They move to Egypt to be with him. Joseph is in a seat of power. But then their generation dies. Exodus tells us that. But the people of God end up fulfilling the mandate from creation. Go and be fruitful and multiply. And God's people become fruitful and they multiply. So in a series of generations, they are multitude. It's also a fulfillment of this promise that is given to Abraham, that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, the sand on the shore. God's people are becoming fruitful. They're living into the mandate from creation and the covenant of Abraham. Okay? So Exodus, that's the prologue. We have this setup. Jacob and his family move in to live with Joseph. There's 70 of them. That's not a lot of people. There are more people in this room than went to go live in Egypt. Okay? We also know from later in the book that this is a time period, by the time that Moses and the Israelites are leaving Egypt from the time that they came in, is a period of around 430 years. Okay, so when we talk about a generation passing away and then becoming multitude, it didn't happen in one generation. The oppression didn't start in one generation. Exodus tells us it's about 400 years by the time they leave from when they enter. So, verses 8 through 14, we really just flew through 1 through 7, but it's fairly straightforward. So, as you know, situations for a family change rapidly across generations. I think about this. I have a master's degree. My grandfather finished 8th grade. Okay, that's 2 generations. That's a big change in family fortune. How much has your family's fortune situation changed in a generation or 2 generations? Think about where your family was 2 or 3 generations ago. 3 generations ago, my family, my great-grandparents were nameless peasants living in Germany. 400 years ago, where was your family? You don't know. Fortunes change a lot. So the fortunes of God's family have changed. A king comes into power. It's interesting that they don't call him Pharaoh yet. They're using the word for king. Hebrew has a word for Pharaoh. It's a Hebrew spelling of the word Pharaoh. But they're using the word king here. A nameless king comes into power. He feels threatened by the number of Israelites living in the land and basically says, and let's read that text today, but basically says that they're going to join our enemies, they'll fight us, we can't have this, it's not good, I'm not about this. They'll join our enemies and leave. So there's a sense in which he's worried about the loss of labor from Egypt. So, if I can get there, sorry, I didn't have it ready. We have in verses 1 through 8 through 14, then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. We must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. Remember, Egypt is the global superpower at this time. It is the richest country, the wealthiest country, the most powerful country. And they're worried about their enemies because when you're the richest and the most powerful country, you have enemies. So they're worried that the Jews living in the land, the Israelites living in the land, will join their enemies, conspire against Egypt, and depart. So naturally, the Pharaoh, the king, does what any person who's worried about someone treating them badly does and treats them worse. You would think, if I'm worried about people leaving me, I should be kind to them. But Pharaoh doesn't do that. He forces the Israelites into labor, makes them slaves, and we can read about that here continuing on. So They put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So we have this affliction of the Hebrew people. The Egyptians are cruel, they're harsh, they're working them tirelessly. But even in spite of that, the Israelites are multiplying, they're growing. In this passage, scholars get their best clue as to whom the Pharaoh might be, and so they think it might be Ramses II. I'm not an Egyptologist. I didn't take Egyptian history, so that doesn't mean a whole lot to me. I don't know if it means a whole lot to you. If you are an amateur Egyptologist out there, you can give your 2 cents in the Q&A portion. But again, Moses doesn't bother to tell us who the king is. He's not worried about it. So he doesn't tell us. He doesn't think it's important enough to the story. And also, I want to point out that if you think about Hebrew literature, there's a common writing device of irony. Irony is a big part of Hebrew writing. So for example, think about the book of Jonah. What's the problem of the book of Jonah? Does Jonah listen to God? No, which is ironic because he's the prophet. So you have the prophet who won't listen. What does listen in the book of Jonah? You get the fish, the plant, the worm, and the Assyrians. They all listen. The Ninevites, they all listen. Jonah doesn't. Irony. You have the prophet of God, who you would think would listen, and then you have literally everything else. I forgot the storm. The storm also listens to God. Everything else in the book of Jonah listens to God, but Jonah doesn't. Irony is a huge part of Hebrew writing, and that really shines through in this first chapter, and we'll point it out as it comes. But part of that irony starts now. We have a nameless king. Okay? And now we're going to move into the next section. Who gets named in verse 15? Who gets named? The midwives. 2 slave women get named, but the king of Egypt does not. There's some irony at play here. Okay, so Moses is saying, here are the important people. The person you thought was important is not, but these 2 slave women are. Now, what do we know about women in this day and age and how they're generally viewed? Is it good? No, women are not viewed with high esteem. Midwifery would be an important and necessary profession, but would not have been one that people thought of as especially notable. You wouldn't talk about midwives too much. But here we have Shiphrah and Puah, and Moses names them, but leaves the king unnamed. So when we turn to verse 15, and I'll read that section for us, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you're helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. I'm hearing laughter, especially from the women. We'll point out some of the humor that's related here in a minute. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Okay. This is where we're going to spend more of our time camping out today because there's more kind of meat in this passage. So again, the king, the nameless king, summons 2 midwives. Moses names them. There's a point of irony. King, important person, doesn't get a name. So, we also see something for the very first time in this verse. Anyone want to guess what it is? It's a word that's getting used for the first time in Scripture. It's Hebrew. So for the very first time, we're seeing these people, the Israelites, identified as Hebrews. So since it's the first time it's come up in Scripture, we've read through all of Genesis, you know it didn't pop up there. It's now popping up for the first time in Exodus chapter 1. We need to kind of talk about where it comes from. There are a couple of theories, and I'll kind of talk through those. The first is that the word in Hebrew for Hebrew is Ivri, and it has a close relationship with the word for crossover, which is avar. And you may be thinking those words don't sound similar at all. But if I were to give you just a very brief and overly simplistic lesson in Hebrew, I would tell you that most Hebrew words are 3 letters long, and you have to remember that the vowels do not count as letters. Okay, so if you were to open a Hebrew Bible, you would see some points, dots underneath the letters, or maybe on top of the letters. The vowels are those dots, and they were added later as an aid to reading out loud. You can read Hebrew and make perfect sense of it without those. In fact, when I learned to read Hebrew starting in college, I learned without vowel pointing. So when my professor handed me my first Hebrew text, it was just consonants. And so when you take the consonants of the words Ivri and Avar, it's the same 3 letters. It's ayin, beit, resh. Okay, same 3 letters, they have the same root, and so it's that word crossover. So it could mean that these are the people that crossed over the foreign boundary into Egypt. It really, for some scholars, is going to refer to the event of them crossing over the Jordan River. It's also a word for Passover, but I want to make sure that we're clear. The word for Passover in Hebrew is a different word. It's Pesach. So the festival Passover, that's going to get talked about later, is not the same word as Avar. So when we hear the word Passover, it's more like I'm passing over a river. It's not this Pesach that's going to happen later. Different words, not related. So, again, same 3 letters, ayin, beit, resh, for Ivri and crossover. So these are the people who crossed over the foreign boundary, crossed over the Jordan River. This is going to become the word that we associate with the language, with the national identity. We talk about the Hebrew people. We actually talk about Hebrews probably more than we talk about Israelites. So it's a very common word for us now. Now, isn't it strange that Pharaoh is calling these people the crossoverers? Because if it's about the Jordan River, they haven't really crossed over it yet. Or if it's about them crossing over the Red Sea, they haven't done that yet. Strange, right? So why would Pharaoh be calling them Hebrews if they haven't avared yet? And so there's some thinking that there's a word that exists in Egyptian, ancient Egyptian, and some other early languages in this region that I have not studied, so I'm going off of what scholars have said, and it's hapiru. And it's kind of a dirty, pejorative word for foreigner. And so hapiru and ivri, so if you have hapiru in Egyptian and you have ivri in Hebrew, they're closely related. So some scholars would say that what's actually happening here is Pharaoh's calling them this kind of slur word for foreigner, but it just happens to sound similar to the word for Hebrew. And so there's a play on words happening here, because when Moses probably sits down to write Exodus, they've already crossed over the Jordan River or the Red Sea, whichever becomes that marking work. Some scholars will say they're called the Hebrews when they cross the Red Sea. Some will say it's when they cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. You can choose which one you think is correct. So, and some scholars say, again, that here Pharaoh's calling them the slur word, and Moses is then kind of turning that on its head and tying their identity as the people who crossed the Red Sea or the Jordan, and kind of turning that word on its head, subverting that word. Just like how Christian used to be a pejorative word, but now we call ourselves Christians. Make sense? So, that's what's at play in this word. That was a long study, long kind of pause on the word Hebrew, but it's the first time it's come up. We need to pay attention to it. So again, and Gerald, where'd you go? I hope you appreciated the pun here that God delivered his people through 2 midwives. That was for you. So, the king, we haven't named him, summons these 2 enslaved women whom Moses names, Shiphrah and Puah. He tells them to kill the Hebrew boys. They don't do it. They lie. This story becomes a type that, again, finds repeating in the New Testament when Herod slaughters the infants to basically snuff out Christ. This is where that story finds its kind of match in the Old Testament. So he calls them back because they're God-fearing and they disobey, and he says, "Why have you let them live?" So they lie and say that the Hebrew women are vigorous. And the word here is directly related to life. So it's like they are teeming with life, which again kind of harkens back to some of this Genesis imagery of being fruitful and multiplying. But, the Hebrew women just aren't like Egyptian women. They're so strong in childbirth, they're so vigorous that the baby's born before we get there. We can't do anything about it. And Pharaoh probably has not had too much to do with childbirth, so he doesn't know. Just hazarding a guess. So they lie, and they get rewarded, which I think is another interesting thing sometimes when we read these Old Testament texts. You have two women. We know that we're not supposed to lie, right? We teach that. Thou shalt not bear false witness. That's coming later in the book. So is it just because the law hasn't been given yet that they lie and they get rewarded? What do we do with that? These women get rewarded for lying. God gives them families, treats the midwives with favor, and the Hebrew people grow because two women lied to the king. So should we tell our children, should I go home and say, Evelyn, my 7-year-old, lying is good. God will bless you when you lie. No, we're all laughing because we know that's not it. But why is it okay to lie? Because this is an interesting question that the text provokes for us. So when I was reading through this passage, meditating over it, I was reminded of Corrie ten Boom's story in The Hiding Place. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Corrie ten Boom, she was a Dutch Christian who lived through the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. And Corrie ten Boom and her family hid Jews in their home. And so Corrie's sister was radically convicted that even under the most dire circumstances, it was never okay to lie. So if you've read The Hiding Place, you know that there's this tension that exists between Corrie and her sister because Corrie knows, and her sister knows, we're hiding Jewish people in our home, and you think we can't lie? How are we supposed to protect these people if we can't tell a lie? It's a good question. So one day, the SS comes and knocks on the door, and Corrie's sister is sitting at the dining room table. And underneath the table is a rug, and underneath the rug is a trap door that goes to basically a secret cellar where the Jews that they're hiding in their home are hiding. And they ask, where are the Jews that you're hiding? And Corrie's sister cackles maniacally and just says, they're under our feet. And the Nazis think she's just crazy and yanking their chain, and they leave. Fascinating story. Thankfully, God worked through her convictions, but I think most of us would say there are circumstances where we know that this is the right thing to do. When life is just off its hinges, we know that sometimes we have to do these things to protect what's right. So I don't know that God is just carte blanche endorsing liars or lying, but we know that there are some times when being faithful to God requires us to do things that in other circumstances aren't right. So I'm not advocating that my daughter lie about whether she cleaned her room. But I think there are times where Scripture shows us that maybe morality isn't as straightforward, black and white as sometimes we think it is. That sometimes doing the right thing is more complex than it seems. Because what if the Hebrew midwives hadn't lied? Maybe God would have protected the babies through another way. That could have happened. That's Corrie ten Boom's sister's argument. And I don't know what to tell you. But God rewards them for lying, so I think there's something to say there. So Pharaoh, and then we're getting to the end here, isn't getting anywhere with the midwives. They're not killing the babies. They're good midwives. They're faithful people of God. So Pharaoh gives up on influencing them and just commands his own people. When you see these baby boys, when you see Hebrew baby boys, throw them in the Nile. So I want to, and this will set Brad up for next week, but point out that once again we have an example of Hebrew irony. Because who is going to come out of the Nile? So a baby boy is going to get put into the Nile River and is going to become the conduit through which God's people get saved, get rescued, and go on the Exodus. So, once again, irony is at play in the text. It's a major facet of Hebrew writing. So, if you suspect that, oh, maybe there's some irony here, there's a good chance if you're reading the Old Testament, there's something to say for that, because it is part of this. Okay, and at the most ironic, Pharaoh becomes the victim of his own command. Okay, throwing a baby boy into the Nile, it becomes his own undoing. So, with that, online crowd, thank you for being with us today. Glad you were here. And now we will turn to Q&A.